So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tiana Lyons King, and I am CAM's Community Engagement Manager. This is this is number 2 of our Centering Equity Workshop series, Cultural Equity as a Human Right. Thank you all for taking the time today to join us. As we begin this event, we'd like to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. California is home to over 150 tribes, and an acknowledgement is just one step towards working with Native communities to build meaningful relationships. Museums and many institutions were founded upon purposeful exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and still benefit from settler colonialism and associated harms. CAM is committed to moving beyond land acknowledgements and into action. We encourage you to find out more about the tribes in your area and find out ways to celebrate and support them. I currently live in San Diego, California, which means I own the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people. Nativeland.ca is a helpful but not definitive resource to learn more about the tribes in your area. I will be placing that link in the chat for you if you'd like to learn more about the space that you currently reside. And I'm really excited to get things started today. Before we do that, I'd just like to take a moment and go over some housekeeping with everyone. I just want to let everyone know that this workshop is being recorded and will be posted to CAM's YouTube. You all will receive a link via email once it is uploaded. Our workshops are a space for learning and collaboration. We ask that you respect yourself and others in the room. The chat box will be open throughout the entire session. Please feel free to interact in that space, whether that's asking a question, interacting with Yvonne, or interacting with others in the room. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and place that question in the chat box, and I will be here to moderate and make sure that your questions don't get lost in the chat. And we will also address those questions throughout the session, as well as there will be different parts of discussion throughout the session, and we ask that you participate in the way that suits you, whether that is in the chat box or whether that's coming off, turning on your video and speaking directly with Yvonne. If you have any technical issues, please just message me in the chat box, or you can email me at engagement@calmuseums.org. I will also place my email in the chat box in case you are not able to write that down in this moment. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Yvonne. She's our instructor today, and I don't want to take up too much of the time here. So Yvonne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all, some again and some for the first time. Would just love to welcome you and invite you to enter your name, your role, and your institution or organization in the chat as a way to see who's in the room, get to know each other. And it also helps me just to ground me in the context of what we'll be spending some time on today, namely cultural equity. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to start it off with just an overview of what our time will consist of, and then also just some grounding before we enter into our conversation. So this is the second in a series of 3 exploring cultural equity, and it's from its theoretical to its more tactical, and then into more storytelling about how it shows up in the work. Today's session will be summarizing session 1's points, really, which were the very many definitions of cultural equity. And then we'll take a look at some cultural equity framework. So this is kind of taking this theoretical idea or very heady idea and seeing how it's showing up in the arts and culture field with all of the change work that our field and many institutions have been undertaking for some time now. What does it look like when we think about a call to action or a set of goals? What are some frameworks that might help us think about which direction or directions we need to take? with advancing cultural equity in our institutions and field. And then how they're playing out, right? With change work, there is both an acknowledgement of the past, past inequities, systemic inequities, and also there are ongoing existing tensions that are just realities of the work. They are not something to be solved. They're more about asking us, how will we move through this? So that will be, for the most part, what we'll be discussing. We will be, I will be inviting you to share some stories of your own work, and certainly answer any questions that come up with regard to the content that we'll be reviewing today. Before we do that, again, for those who've just joined us, I'd like to invite you to enter your name, your role, and your institution or organization in the chat so that we can get to know each other and build a sense of togetherness in this virtual realm. I'd also like to invite everyone to take a moment to just ground yourself. We are in a season where there are a lot of things going on. There are a lot of things both globally and locally that are happening within our world that we might be reflecting on, acting on. But what we do know is that when we meet on behalf of ourselves, the CAM community and the community at large, we are conducting ceremony. In Indigenous practices, this means a strengthening of connection, providing healing or clarity, marking significant moments, remembering and practicing gratitude. So breath is an important part of this journey. Just be aware of that. Grounding ourselves in place, certainly, and what that means. And then, of course, accepting and acknowledging the collective and personal grief that we are all carrying and experiencing, both within ourselves and in relationship to others, and understanding that there are many ways that it intersects our lives and our work. So just a moment to recognize that right now. Well, so let's take a little recap of our first session. What we understood or learned together was that the fields discussion, the arts and culture fields discussion around cultural equity has been going on for a while. There's no one definition of cultural equity. There's a sense of cultural equity. There are some definitions that have been put out. But oftentimes the conversations take place at a highly conceptual or theoretical level. So it makes sense for some of us in that way. But then what I find people are left asking themselves are, well, how does this show up in my work, in my decision-making, in my planning, in the integration of this work in relationship to the institution's wider planning or bigger work and setting of goals. And that's real, and that's why we're having these conversations. We want to get to that tactical level through storytelling, and that's a really powerful tool in which shared knowledge can be brought into a space like this. So essentially, we're aiming to explore how cultural equity is operationalized in museums and institutions. So when we talk about change work, we understand, because cultural equity is change work. We're seeking to change something for the better. It is also justice work. We found that cultural equity lives in a justice lane. Change work happens at the personal, organizational, and systemic levels, not methodically, but at the same time, right? They're happening concurrently. And so there's a lot to hold there. So it also allows us to understand what's the work that I have to do, what is the work that is possible within my organization or institution? And then what is work that requires a larger movement building across the field for systemic change? So it's helpful to see cultural equity and the efforts around it within those lanes, but also understanding that they will overlap and cross. So as we said, there is no one definition of cultural equity. Like concepts of equality and equity, cultural equity and our understanding of it continues to grow, expand, and evolve. Again, reminding ourselves that cultural equity lives in a justice lane. This is a human right. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 27, states everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. Cultural equity living in a justice lane calls for the dismantling of discriminatory systems of all forms, anything that is creating a barrier to fully participating in arts and culture. It also addresses the history in our country of the homogeneity of arts and cultural institutions, content, staff, and leadership. Cultural equity relates to historic and remaining inequities in our arts and culture ecosystem, and is a conversation that is rooted in, but not exclusively about race. While race is undeniably important to the work of justice in our country, we take into account certainly other aspects of identity and community infrastructure in both obvious and subtle ways. So diversity, when we think about diversifying as a strategy of cultural equity, this often starts at a reference point of race, but advocates for broader considerations, what we've been talking about as intersectionality, right? The sweet spot is the X, right? The intersection of diverse experiences that require work in order to bring these groups towards greater equity. So we acknowledge that we begin with race and then we continue with an intersectional lens. Again, UNESCO Declaration of Cultural Diversity, Article 5, the right to access to participation in and enjoyment of culture. So when we start to get at a more grounded definition, we look to Americans for the Arts, and they define cultural equity as the embodiment of the values, policies, and practices that ensure that all people are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. Again, everyone deserves equal access to a full, vibrant, creative life, which is essentially deserving access to a healthy, democratic society. Oftentimes in conversations around cultural equity, there's a misperception that this is change or social justice work light, right? It's a light. Oh, that's cute. But in fact, when you think about where we are at with regard to cultural equality and the need for cultural equity to get us there, to make up for those big gaps that we experience in our arts and culture field and its systems, it becomes quite an undertaking, and often, and most certainly, intersects other equity lanes, which we'll learn about in a minute. So equity lanes like racial equity, accessibility, inclusion, et cetera. So when we begin to see the intersectionality of cultural equity and what it requires in order for all people to have a fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources, it becomes quite a complex and very worthwhile undertaking. This is not change work light. And I think we, having been in this work for quite some time, understand what some of those experiences in the work might be. Americans for the Arts also acknowledges the past, which is essential in any equity effort. And so AFTA's statement acknowledges the following and reflects a cultural equity approach or framework that requires the acknowledgement of historical and persistent and reason why there are inequities, right? There are systemic reasons why there are inequities that exist within our field, within our broader society, because our field is a reflection of the broader US context. And there were systems, there were laws, literally, there were social cues, right, that excluded and oppressed others and invited and welcomed others. So there's the acknowledgement of that structural systemic inequity, right? That very real fact of how did we get here? Why are some served more than others? Why are some organizations funded more than others, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it also, right, acknowledging the past within your museum and institution is a very you don't start within a vacuum, right? You don't start work within a vacuum. There is very likely a long history within your institution and museum in advancing cultural equity work, right? Whether small or large, and the reality of that work is there were some things that were successful and there were others that weren't. There were some things that were very easeful in moving forward, and there were some that had a lot of hurdles and barriers to overcome. When we undertake cultural equity work in our institutions or organizations, it's important to review that history, to talk to people, right? Because a lot of the work may or may not be documented. Who was leading that work in the past? This is part of your cultural equity story, right? This is part of your museum's cultural equity history and story. It gets you closer to when you all, with your teams, with change work teams, departments, boards, committees, when you sit down, you're able to share that history of what worked and what didn't in order to get closer to moving, right, your needle towards greater cultural equity. So it's both a broader acknowledgement of broader structural systemic inequities within our country and the systems that we live and work in. And it's also a revisiting of what has your museum done, right? What were the efforts that brought you to this place or this conversation and this work around cultural equity? So revisiting the past, very, very important there. Okay. That was a brief review of what we did in. Okay, with that, we're going to move forward into the what we'll be discussing today. Taking a step back, how is cultural equity work showing up in our arts and culture field? And what are some of the other considerations we might need to be aware of as we talk about, imagine, and strategize within this work? So let's take another look. So for not just during the COVID lockdown, not just during and post the murder of George Floyd, for quite some time, our field has been, and our communities have been called to higher standards. What we heard very acutely between 2020 and 2022 was that people, whether it's audiences, staff, or leadership, people want to know their community stands strong with them. People want us, those in this change work, to speak up and be specific and clear. If we agree that cultural equity work is the work of change, we've been called to these higher standards when it comes to that work. We also, we've also been doing a lot of work around advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and the myriad acronyms that have evolved and been developed over the recent past. The work of cultural equity is no easy feat, especially in understanding that we are now being called to higher standards. We know what was attempted in the past. We know what did not work. We are not trying to see that repeated again in the present or in the future. So this is about a major culture shift. If you haven't felt that yet, I don't know where you've been, but we are under a major culture shift here, not just demographically, which we've all been discussing, and we see on the news and in reports. This is about relevance. This is about a major culture shift that is asking for institutions, our arts and culture institutions and organizations, to be more reflective of the communities that they serve. So people in this moment, again, are demanding the following from us. And we know that in order for lasting change to happen, it needs to happen at all those levels we discussed, at the personal level, the organizational, and the systemic level. So we ground ourselves in the work, understanding the moment that we find ourselves in. It's calling us to higher standards. So where are we in this moment? In March 2021, Americans for the Arts laid out some critical, as they call them, trends. I call them issues because they may or may not go away, so I don't see them as trends. But we also understand that forecasting any kind of set of considerations is very tricky. Things that people forecasted a year ago don't seem to be coming forth today. So we understand that, we review these issues within that context. So the first issue that AFTA has put forth as critical for the arts and culture field is that social justice movements will continue. This is not going away. This is not an era we're experiencing currently. So we have definitely been feeling the economy restart, and we're also kind of seeing people are being unusual, being conservative with budgeting, with savings. So it's not exactly flowing at the moment. How that hits reports. So budget ripple effects in local state governments will continue. This is 2022, but will continue to make it a risky time for the entire creative sector. And we have been very, very lucky to live in a state, or not lucky, but through our advocacy efforts, we live in a state where recovery programs and funding have been optimized for our field, have been offered, and that's been definitely closing the gaps on some of these more challenging budgeting times. Certainly, again, reckoning with historic and current racial inequities, that will continue to be an important focus for our field. This I would definitely put at the top of the list. We've been seeing this unfold for some time. Plight of independent creative workers will move up the priority list. And I will just say the plight of arts and culture workers, right? I'm going to expand that. It's not just independent creative workers like our artists, like our gig workers, like our contract for services, but it really is the labor field at large within our it is really the labor within our field at large that is going to be impacted and going to be moving up in terms of what we're addressing, the challenges we're addressing, whether it's budgeting, capacity, sustainability, et cetera. Digital is here to stay. Some folks do not like to hear this, although this is not new. I believe it was a 2011 report from the Irvine Foundation that spoke to how Californians take in or experience arts and culture, and the number of young folks that were taking in those experiences digitally was already telling us where our arts and culture programming and services and overall presence needs to be, which is in the digital realm. That we were forced to enter into that space or that exercise during COVID lockdown. But we see still across the board that our organizations and institutions remain underinvested in this realm, whether it's institutional budgets or how the funding field is focused and supporting digital efforts, digital capacity building. We're still seeing an underfunding or estimation of this realm. This goes back to relevance. It goes to accessibility. It's not just about having views and likes, etc. This is about greater inclusion around your programming, around in-person activities and experiences. We certainly have heard more recently through the SAG efforts that AI was a focus of their negotiations. So we see that robots and AI are going to be perhaps a greater consideration for arts and culture organizations and institutions. All aspects of health. People are more focused on health and how work and work experiences impact health positively or negatively than ever before. This will continue to take the spotlight, including these types of in-person experiences. We've been hearing in recent reports that countries that took longer to get back out there as a result of COVID protections and lockdowns have created new habits. They're calling it the hermit phase. We're in a hermit phase. So it's not just about opening the doors, right? It's also about psychology. It's also about how safe do people feel, and that is highly subjective. So health, aspects of health, how museums address health in its programming. We saw, we're seeing quite a few museums actually revisit missions to their own missions to incorporate a health-centered approach using arts and culture to serve their communities, to serve their audiences. So it's a really interesting time in terms of how museums are seeing the importance of health and putting that forth as a central cornerstone of who they are and what they do. Getting back out there. So everything we've discussed, certainly it's happening in spurts. Many of you may be finding that your annual special event might be getting the same number of contributions, but maybe not the same attendance record. And that will continue for some time. So how might we think about diversifying those experiences, diversifying how we consider the public, our stakeholders, our constituents, our communities experiencing us and our museum. So quite a few things to consider here as they intersect our cultural equity work. So cultural equity work as change work. It's important to ask ourselves And to be honest, I mean, as the arts and culture field, we are lovably overly optimistic. But cultural equity requires acknowledging the past, but it also requires being honest with ourselves, both as a community within a museum, but also as a human being within a society at large. So one question that's really important to ask, and I would say one thing to acknowledge, do we have a shared understanding and language for the change that we want to see? We had a lot of terms moving around over the past several years when it comes to this type of work. But one thing I always ask myself is, the terms that I have adopted and use, can they be shared with someone who's walking down the street, not involved with the arts and culture field, not necessarily a person that shows up every time to our museum? Can I tell them about the change work we're doing? Can I tell them about cultural equity and our commitment to it in a language that is shared, right? In a language that isn't technical, isn't changing overnight. So it's important to take a moment to establish that shared understanding and language. That requires ongoing education, both for ourselves as well as for our teams. And so the commitment to ongoing education, the commitment to greater understanding is such an important part of change work. I will add that there has to be an acknowledgement that terms may come and they will sometimes need to go, right? That this ever evolving organic nature of how we communicate about our change work. So are we committed to the education and learning required in this moment for everyone to engage? There are some members of our team who are highly advanced in this work, and they have been around the block before. But there are some that are just starting. In an effort to advance greater inclusion, or what I like to call inclusion as, are we ensuring that we're bringing everyone along? Here we're asked, are we committed to the education and learning required in this moment for everyone to engage? So oftentimes that requires a level set. So for those of us who've been in this work for a long time, we have to be patient. For those who haven't, we have some catching up to do. And that's okay. Again, do we have language that is shared and sustainable, right? It's a language we use, is it going to go away tomorrow? If so, maybe we don't want to use that language. Are we committed to the ongoing long-term learning that will be needed to sustain the work? This is not, certainly there is business to be done, but if you have no relevance, which is really, in my estimation, the long-term goal of cultural equity, right, is everyone gets to participate, everyone gets to be reflected, everyone gets the fair share of resources. But what this really is understanding that this work will need to keep moving, will need to keep responding, will need to be sustained in order for it to be kept alive, not unlike democracy. So are we committed to the ongoing long-term learning that will be needed to sustain the work? I will say, as a consultant to many, that is something we need to work on. This is not about taking your medicine and then you're all done. This is a long-term commitment. And when you think you're done, you need to ask the question, who else is not present? Who else are we not serving? What else needs to be done? Because it's ever, it will move forward. It will continue to require care and nurturing. So cultural equity lives in the realm of other justice lanes or change work lanes. I call it change work because at its essence, that's what it is. We're seeking to change something. So cultural equity certainly lives within, alongside general equity, which is defined as the promoting of justice, impartiality, and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. It also lives alongside racial equity. We've talked and explored that quite a bit over the past several years. And then certainly it has aspects of inclusion. If you think about how do we bring everyone along, right, with us, we understand that there's a complexity to our identities, and that inclusion seeks to acknowledge the degree to which diverse individuals can participate fully, contribute best efforts, and have their best experience with the least amount of barriers and aggravations. So that crosses accessibility, other intersectional identities, LGBTQ folks, immigrant communities, many other change work lanes exist under that inclusion. So there's cultural equity, right? Saying we need to advance that all humans have a right to produce, present, and participate in arts and culture. Therefore, it must take into consideration these other change work lanes. It must acknowledge that these other change work lanes can impact how we advance cultural equity, what we might be needing to pay attention to in our efforts to advance cultural equity within our institutions. And also acknowledging that these will oftentimes, the lanes will cross and then separate, right? We might go into one lane for a while, move into another lane, but they're all essentially getting us to the same place. So when we think about cultural equity in this context, again, it is no light matter. It is not, this is heavy work. This is complex work. This is, again, not something where you just take your prescription and then you're all good. This is connected to broader systems change. So one of the more seminal research efforts was around cultural equity was put forth by Create Equity. Create Equity has defined cultural equity as follows. And Create Equity was a virtual think tank and publication founded in 2007 to explore issues in arts policy, philanthropy, and research at a system level. This initiative sunsetted in 2018, but its work remains available online. So as we discussed, cultural equity, Create Equity also acknowledges and advances that cultural equity is a conversation that is rooted in race, but it's not exclusive to race. So again, acknowledging that the need to include, perhaps under that inclusion lane, right, the need to include measures of social difference, such as ethnicity, gender identity, socioeconomic status, age, class, and ability status is equally important when we consider what the needs around cultural equity might be for our institution, or in a broader sense, our field. So Create Equity asks, what are the ingredients of a cultural experience that people find valuable? Are they consistent across demographics? What effect does institutional scale have on the ability to create specific benefits for artists and audiences? So we want to take a look, dive deeper into Create Equity, what they call 4 visions. They're really frameworks for cultural equity. And these 4 visions have disseminated kind of conversations, historical work, policy efforts, on the ground organizational efforts, usually by culturally specific organizations. They've distilled all of this into these 4 visions or 4 frameworks through which cultural equity might be advanced. And we're going to take a deep dive into that in a second, but I want to pause So just as a little reminder, Create Equity was a think tank and blog and did a series of publications around cultural equity around 2005. And part of that work was to distill all that they had learned into the following 4 visions for cultural equity. So Create Equity acknowledges that this list of visions represents that distillation, and also want to warn against, this is not an effort to oversimplify the work of cultural equity, which we know is complex. And certainly the thinking and the successes of many advocates for cultural equity have reflected that complexity. So when we listen or read about their stories, we understand whether it's a long-term effort to arrive at that success, or just a series of complicated turns and twists. We know that this work requires persistence and resilience. So important to acknowledge that these visions are not mutually exclusive. Even those who have been working in cultural equity efforts, whether they're culturally specific organizations or arts advocates, they themselves use interchangeable values and perspectives across these 4 visions. So I wanted to make that a clear point before we dive into the specifics of each. These exist in dialogue with each other, and so they certainly overlap and cross and build solidarity oftentimes across themselves. So just want to make that really clear before we dive in. Okay, let's start with the first vision, diversity. So over the course of the past half century or more, conversations about diversity have tended to be the focus of our work within the arts and culture field. It also has been the focus of institutions and museums, first through a lens or through relationships with audiences, then evolved into programming, and then considerations around the importance and the necessity around the diversification of their leadership. So one thing that everyone in this cultural equity conversation can agree on, well, I don't know about everyone, but most of the folks in cultural equity work can agree on, is that mainstream institutions, which we can consider big budget, right? Big budget, nonprofit, may show up as a symphony, a museum, a major presenter, etc., have been too homogenous. The diversity vision that Create Equity puts forth seeks to rectify this, calling for these institutions to become more reflective of the communities they serve. Much of the interest in diversity springs from a recognition of the changing demographics of America, which we have heard much about. So we understand that diversity has been the vision that has been probably longest in play, at least within our professional lifespans, and certainly has a history prior to us. But diversity's core concern, according to Create Equity, is who is ultimately benefiting from the work, right? Who's ultimately benefiting from the work that your museum does? If diverse audiences are taking advantage, the thought is, then that is the surest sign of success. Many early efforts thus adopted the theme of access to the arts. We've heard about access a lot in the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, access, on the assumption that underrepresented audiences wanted to participate but could not because of barriers like cost and convenience. But there are barriers that go farther back that have to do with less less proud moments of our country's history, and that have compounded over time generationally in how we navigate spaces and how we feel included and belong, if we belong someplace. And so it's much more complex than just translation, cost, convenience, right? Language, cost, convenience, which I hear a lot of institutions kind of default to as core strategies of diversification. But as the work around cultural equity has moved forward in our field, Create Equity also discovered that simply offering free events and pursuing more targeted marketing wasn't enough. And the focus then shifted to, who do you have exhibited? Who do you have in your collections? What special events are you planning and offering? And do they reflect a diverse artists, set of artists? Do they reflect diversity on stage, on walls, in collections, etc.? So that it went from audiences to programming, and now leadership, whether curatorial, CEO, executive director, board members, that has taken on the next evolution of this conversation around diversity. So turning to staff and boards of organizations with regard to diversifying decision makers, diversifying perspectives. And so whereas diversity began as a simple push for more diverse audiences, today it calls for change at the highest levels. Second vision, prosperity. So prosperity vision takes diversity's belief in the power of organizational scale and applies it to institutions started and led by artists of color, or what we call culturally specific institutions and organizations. We learned a bit about the history of culturally specific organizations in our first session and why and how they came about. And so this vision of prosperity says, well, we'll take, for example, Alvin Ailey, the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, as an example of what prosperity might look like. We have an organization that is culturally specific, that has expanded in scale and capacity, and holds a long history of success, or what our field refers to as legitimation, right? The longer you've been around, the more legit that you come off to audiences, funders, partners. This is what the SMU Data Arts research calls legitimation. So these institutions follow the standard model of nonprofit growth, right? It's just culturally specific organizations that reflect diversity, advance cultural equity at the scale of something like that is comparable to our larger institutions and longer standing institutions. Though diversity is unmistakably a call for change, its supporters share early American philanthropists' faith that the institutions they founded can and must play a central, unifying role in the cultural life of their communities. So not everyone agrees, right? That the be-all to end-all might be your museum or institution. Though rarely stated outright, an underlying assumption of prosperity, the prosperity vision, is that large, established institutions of color will last longer and thus provide more benefit to society over many generations than an ecosystem of smaller organizations that may be more transitory in nature. We'll speak about an example of how that got some pushback too in a bit. But what the calling for the prosperity of vision evolved out of was the success of a cohort of pioneering artists who created their own organizations in the late 50s through the 1970s. We tackled some of that history again in the first session, in response to a lack of existing opportunities to pursuing their creative work. I would also say audiences did not have access to these institutions oftentimes, and were not included or invited. Many of these artists adopted the nonprofit model that was gaining ground during that period. And so they mirrored kind of what the mainstream institutional frameworks that existed at that time were, and made it their own, reflected their communities, reflected their ensembles or their collections around their communities and communities' history. So we understand historical organizations that reflect that are free, our free Southern Theater, El Teatro Campesino, Studio Museum in Harlem, Dance Theater of Harlem, Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, and the Negro Ensemble Community Company, among many, many others across the country. And so the prosperity vision takes on, reflects those examples and takes on the existing structures and systems that create these larger, at scale, longer lasting organizations and institutions. Then we have redistribution. So if the diversity and prosperities centric frames focus on working with what we've had for a long period of time, namely institutions, systems, whether it's the nonprofit system or the best practices that we often see, or a Eurocentric lens, both diversity and prosperity work within those realms, right? They work to reform. Redistribution, however, focuses on the full ecosystem of individuals and institutions that comprise a community. So it's not just about here's the art and here's the community. It's here we are as a part of a whole, as a part of an ecosystem that works together to build opportunities, experiences, etc. So a core belief of redistribution is that all participants, from large institutions to one-person operations, should be afforded the opportunity to succeed. It's important to note that advocates of redistribution don't have a problem with large institutions that celebrate artists of color, as long as smaller organizations are able to share in the wealth. Beyond the inherent justice in giving funds to oppressed groups, advocates point to the country's changing demographics as additional justification for redistribution. It is more efficient to accomplish the goals of cultural equity by redirecting resources to organizations with already diverse staff and audiences, rather than to put effort into diversifying mainstream organizations. So important point there, right? This is why are we investing in the diversification of large and prosperity of larger institutions when we already have what we need in smaller organizations or our collectives or one-on-one efforts. So that is what redistribution calls for, and also challenges in other frameworks. Finally, vision 4 is self-determination. And I think Jennifer spoke to this in her comment in chat. And you may have noticed that with each successive vision, the list represents a further rejection as we move along from diversity to prosperity to redistribution to self-determination. We're seeing a gradual a larger gap or a larger distancing, and some would say rejection of status quo. So self-determination in many ways is the most radical departure of all, as Create Equity contends. The self-determination theory of cultural equity calls for full participation in and expression of cultural life for communities of color through models that are organic to these communities and that look beyond established nonprofit arts funding and advocacy tactics. At its zenith, self-determination seeks a wholesale societal and cultural transformation. With self-determination, ownership of cultural decisions is located within the community, believing that it's the community members themselves who get to shape their own cultural life. Advocates of self-determination view the current nonprofit and funding system in the US with heavy skepticism. To them, legacy of racism and class hegemony is still very much alive today and will remain so as long as it continues to be largely controlled by the same wealthy white elite class that founded it. So we can see that there is an acknowledgement of history in the self-determination, and also the assertion that the result or the consequences of those inequities throughout history have compounded to where we find ourselves in today, and that those systems that created those inequities or perpetuated those inequities cannot serve as a solution for advancing cultural equity. So self-determination questions the notion that, for example, people of color could ever feel truly welcomed in engaging with mainstream nonprofit organizations, regardless of the changes in the work that they make. Further, working within the system to grow nonprofits led by artists of color, as we see in the prosperity vision, only reflects and validates what our existing economic systems, which they interpret as inequitable, racial inequities that exist. It only serves to continue to perpetuate and move through those systems that we already have found, in their opinions, to be ineffective, damaging, and oppressive. And so redistribution calls for the dismantling of those systems. And the thinking naturally leads to an emphasis on the application of art towards greater social change goals. De-emphasizing a traditional nonprofit, and certainly subsidy for art projects and organizations that reflect the community, driven by the community, as critical and important. So 4 visions. I myself have been exposed to all 4 in different spaces, in different conversations. Certainly overlapping and acknowledging, yes, that's important, and right, that kind of conversation. I see your point and your value structure, and I want to uplift the following, whatever that might be. So a lot of not one or the other, but a lot of, okay, but how do we move forward? So one thing to acknowledge also, if you haven't already, with self-determination, is that obviously existing class considerations and skepticism towards our existing socioeconomic the socioeconomic system that we live and work under is met with much skepticism. And so what really the self-determination is saying, listen, that utopian, what they interpret as the diversity vision as a utopian, colorblind harmony, right, really ignores oppressed groups that exist at the intersections of a wider diversity lens. And so they call for not only the acknowledgement of that history and current conditions, but also they want to control of resources, traditions, their own traditions, and spaces that they can call their own. So the prosperity, redistribution, and especially self-determination visions all incorporate elements of ownership based on common heritage and identity. And diversity and prosperity see institutions as vital infrastructure with enormous potential for community benefit. Redistribution sees value in institutions too, but is also keenly aware of how institutional values, for example, prioritizing financial growth, sustainability, and formal structures, have historically been biased against communities of color. Self-determination thinks institutional values are a corrupting influence and rejects the idea of them being the only model of health, questioning even bedrock institutions like the nonprofit sector itself. And so just, we want to also remind ourselves that the difference can be seen in how diversity and prosperity very often celebrates or cultivates specific people of color, but also expands to other identity lenses. So LGBTQ, artists living with disabilities, again, first generation immigrant, et cetera, et cetera. And so expanding that idea. So whole community self-determination also tends to see cultures defined more by heritage than creativity, placing a relatively higher value on elders, ancestors, and tradition, and critiquing diversity and prosperity's emphasis on originality and individual expression in the context of judging artistic merit. So we have a conflict of values, right? The values that existing institutions and frameworks have put forth within the arts and culture field, within the museum context, and what communities or folks that advocate for self-determination regard as values, right? As valuable, ancestral knowledge, shared knowledge, generational knowledge, oral tradition. So some very clear differences in values there. Across all four visions, there exists opportunities to collaborate or to integrate or to create strategies that use many of what these visions are calling for, but it also increases the or acknowledges that there is tension also across them, right? Tension, the uncomfortable place, we have learned is a necessary part of this work. And with these four visions, there certainly is their fair share of tension as folks advocate for one over the other. And in my opinion, that's the pitfall, like that's the misstep. It's not an or conversation, it's an and conversation. So I want to pause here. I'm just trying to look at my notes to see if I've missed anything that is important to share. Thank
you so much, Yvonne. Sorry for the delay there. I didn't realize my video wasn't on. Thank you so much, Yvonne, for your time today, and thank you all for joining us today. We will be continuing this with one more session on November 30th. So if you'd like to join us in that space, you are welcome to do so. We have the link on our website, and I will also be sending the link to everyone in the chat. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us. Hope everyone's having a great day and everyone has a good rest of your week.